seems crazy to believe, but in just about a week from when this video will go live, Five Nights at Freddy's will be 10 years old. What's even more crazy is that some of the lore debates we're still having to this day will be just as old. Like Golden Freddy. Ever since he made his appearance in FNAF 1, people haven't stopped debating who he is, and there are more theories about his identity than ever. Another theory that has been debated for nearly just as long is who stuffed the children's bodies into the suits, William Afton or the puppet? With FNAF 1, I think everyone just naturally assumed it was the killer. But then FNAF 2 came in and threw a wrench in things, and ever since then, people haven't been able to agree on who it was. Today, I hope to be able to solve this debate with an answer that's a little different from the traditional WillStuff and PuppetStuff explanations. Because as it turns out, there are pretty big problems with both theories. But first, let's start with the basics. What do the two theories have going for them? Or against them? For PuppetStuff, we have what originally caused everyone to consider the puppet as the one stuffing the kids. In FNAF 2, one of the secret death minigames is Give Gifts, Give Life, in which the puppet gives gifts to 4 of the dead children, and then gives life, putting Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy heads on them. Most people at the time, I think, saw this and assumed that this was showing the puppet stuffing the kids' bodies into the suits. After all, it's giving life to them by putting on the animatronic heads. At face value, it seems like this is what the minigame is clearly showing us. In my opinion, this is very, very strong evidence for PuppetStuff. There's also the fact that in the second set of murders at the FNAF 2 location, William leaves the bodies scattered throughout the restaurant rather than stuffing them, almost like he was relying on the puppet to stuff the bodies like the first time. Now, what's the evidence for William stuffing the kids? Well, basically everything else. Back in FNAF 1, the puppet didn't exist, and FNAF 1 was intended to be a standalone game. So when the newspaper clippings in the first game say that someone killed the kids, their bodies were never found, and implies the bodies were stuffed into the suits, the natural conclusion is that it was the killer who did it. The puppet stuffing the kids would have to have been a retcon that was made in the second game. This in itself isn't necessarily a problem. Scott did say that he made one retcon, and this could be it. But I always try not to fall back on calling something a retcon. I only ever play that card as a last resort, when there really isn't any other explanation, like with Charlie's gender in FNAF 6. I think people nowadays are way too quick to declare something a retcon when it contradicts their theory. So to me, this seems like a valid point in favor of WillStuff. Keeping to FNAF 1, there's also the entire reason why the animatronics stuff you into a suit in the first place, which is because they think you're their killer. So why specifically stuffing a guard into a suit? We've known Phone Guy's explanation of thinking you're a bare endo is wrong, since Bonnie doesn't do anything with the bare endo in parts and service. They probably do it because it's what the killer did to them. So they find who they think was their killer and get revenge by doing the same thing to him. This doesn't work if it was the puppet who stuffed them with the intention of saving them. Then again, maybe it's just not that deep, and stuffing you into a suit was just a cool method of death Scott thought of. Moving on to stronger evidence, we have the Pizza Party minigame in Help Wanted. Pizza Party is essentially a recreation of the missing children incident, albeit with a lot of creative liberties taken. It has some interesting implications if we were to take it as at least a somewhat accurate representation. In the minigame, Glitchtrap lures you backstage where the animatronics are. And if the animatronics are back here rather than on stage like they normally are, that means William himself took them off stage, as Glitchtrap represents William. And there's no reason he would do this and partially dismantle them on the night of his murders unless he was intending to stuff the children into them. Why do all of this if he was just planning to leave the bodies laying around? The animatronics also have party hats, which implies that Glitchtrap/William specifically brought the animatronics here for the children and the party. When we go past the curtain onto the stage, we then become Freddy himself, implying that we've possessed him. The fact that it's Glitchtrap who lures us onto the stage, directly after which we possess Freddy, implies that this was his plan and his doing, us becoming Freddy. Glitchtrap dances in the dining area as if in celebration of this fact. So although Pizza Party doesn't explicitly show Glitchtrap stuffing the children into the suits, it very much implies it. Now, the biggest argument puppet stuffers will use to counter this is that Pizza Party is merely a loose, symbolic recreation. Some details are provably wrong, like Glitchtrap luring us backstage rather than the safe room, and the fact that the minigame has us traveling through a bunch of different FNAF locations rather than just Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. But I think these changes make sense though. The bizarre, dreamlike level design was done to make an interesting minigame. Simply walking down the halls of a pizzeria wouldn't be too terribly fun. Glitchtrap luring us backstage rather than the safe room also gives the minigame a more streamlined story, being able to go from where Glitchtrap lured us straight to the stage, instead of requiring a step between the safe room and the stage, during which we'd be dead. But the things that imply William stuffed the kids don't make sense as changes made to accommodate the minigame format. What's the point in having the animatronics backstage? And even then, what's the point in having them be partially taken apart, or with party hats? Why have Glitchtrap lure us to the stage, which is the exact point when we become Freddy, if not to imply that Glitchtrap put us in Freddy? And sure, it's not meant to be a literal or very accurate recreation, but why add details that clearly imply Glitchtrap stuffed the kids if William never did it? That crosses the line from taking harmless creative liberties to just implying things that aren't true. And for what reason? To me, Pizza Party is very strong evidence for WillStuff. There's also the FNAF movie in which William was said to have hid the children in the suits. And yes, I'm sure people will be quick to point out that it's a different continuity and not necessarily reflective of the game canon. But when every other continuity, this one and the Silver Ice trilogy, has William stuffing the kids, you start to think that maybe it's because this is how it's always been. With the novel trilogy, you could argue that this was changed because the puppet didn't exist in the books, which is completely fair. But the puppet was teased in the credits of the FNAF movie with the jingle of My Grandfather's Clock, which is the same song the puppet's music box plays. During this, a voice spells out, "Come find me," which implies that the puppet already exists. So the same argument doesn't quite work here. The movie also clearly spelled out William's motivation for stuffing the bodies in the suits, which was to keep the bodies hidden because no one would think to check there. It's difficult to think that William wouldn't have the same motivation in the games, unless he just didn't care about being caught. And again, considering in FNAF 1, he was the only actor on the night of the murders that the game mentioned, surely this must have been the intention in FNAF 1 too. Granted, in the FNAF 2 murders, he didn't seem to care about hiding the bodies for whatever reason. I can't really explain that. However, WillStuff has one big hole in it, which is also PuppetStuff's greatest point. Give gifts, give life. Most WillStuff believers would have you believe that the puppet played pretty much no part in the animatronic's possession, that she wasn't even necessary. But this leaves them with no good explanation for the minigame. The best attempt at an explanation for give gifts that I've come across is the idea of it being a failed happiest day. The minigame supposedly shows us the puppet's first attempt at freeing the children to give them their happiest day, but she failed somehow. The idea, I guess, comes from the fact that the puppet gives the children heads of the characters like the masks in Happiest Day. Except the puppet doesn't give anyone masks in Happiest Day. The children already have their masks before the puppet arrives. The puppet is just there to deliver the cake to Cassidy. This is also just an extremely tough interpretation to arrive at simply by looking at the minigame. Like, you have the puppet giving life to the dead bodies by putting the suit heads on them. If you were to just look at this minigame without bringing in other theories, there's basically no way to come to the conclusion that she's trying to free the children from the suits. It's clearly the exact opposite. Give gifts, give life is about the children being given life, whereas Happiest Day is them moving on from life. It just doesn't work. Another thing is that this interpretation is really just an attempt to explain away an inconvenient minigame rather than ascribe any real meaning or purpose to it. If nothing actually resulted from it, why does it even exist? Why was it shown to us? Clearly, Charlie must have done something of consequence in Give Gifts, Give Life, or else it has no purpose. And I'm not aware of any better explanation from WillStuffers who don't think the puppet had anything to do with the kid's possession. Others just throw up their hands and say, I don't know. And so I arrive at the big problem with both WillStuff and PuppetStuff. The issue with these two positions is that they tend to look at the debate as a strict either-or, specifically in regard to Give Gifts, Give Life. PuppetStuffers base their position almost entirely on this minigame at the expense of all the other evidence, and WillStuffers either explain away the minigame as being completely insignificant or just ignore it entirely. Like I said, I really don't like presuming things to be retcons just because they don't fit with a certain theory. When looking at issues like this, I think it's best to consider every piece of evidence to be just as canon as the rest. Which means rather than siding with Give Gifts, Give Life over all the other evidence, or vice versa, we should be looking for a way to make all the evidence fit together. So my theory is a bit different. Rather than it being entirely one or the other, I believe it was a combination of both William's and the puppet's actions that caused the children to possess the animatronics. And no, I'm not suggesting that they both stuffed the kids or that they were somehow working together. I think William was the one to stuff the children, but it was the puppet who then bound their souls to the suits, causing the possession. Let me explain. William, I think, definitely stuffed the children for all the reasons already listed. The FNAF 1 newspaper clippings, the animatronics stuffing the guards, pizza party, and the movie. Give Gifts, Give Life is one of the more squishy pieces of evidence because it's at least somewhat symbolic. The puppet probably did not actually leave presents next to each of the bodies. So when the puppet puts the animatronic heads on the bodies, I don't think it necessarily means that she literally did so. The heads could just be representing what kind of life the puppet's giving them, which is life in the animatronics they were already stuffed into. Probably the first objection to this people will have is, why would this be necessary? After all, Charlie didn't need any help to possess the puppet. Shouldn't the children just naturally possess the suits they were stuffed into? Actually, no. And the fourth closet explains why. Yes, the whole thing with it being a different continuity. While that's true, it's still a part of the FNAF universe and technically canon. So while events aren't necessarily the same, concepts and rules about things like the nature of possession can be carried over. At one point in the book, William has a conversation with Jessica where he's explaining to her how the animatronics became possessed. He makes it a big point that she understands it wasn't just the bodies being in the suits that caused the possession, but that they were killed inside the suits. How did the creatures at Freddy's move of their own will with no outside force controlling them, he asked. The children were still inside. Their souls were inside those creatures, she said. Oh, Jessica, come now. What else? How did they die, Jessica? Jessica gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. How, Jessica? Afton demanded. You killed them, she said, and he made an impatient sound. They died in the suits, she said hoarsely. The bodies were bound inside, along with their souls. He nodded. The spirit follows the flesh, it would seem, and also the pain. Jessica and the others already knew the bodies were stuffed in the suits from the first book. William places special emphasis on how they died to explain their possession. The implication he makes is that if the children hadn't been killed inside the suits, they wouldn't have possessed them at all. This is significant because it is notably different from the games. In the games, the children were killed outside of the suits and only stuffed later. In Foxy Go Go Go, the 5 children are shown dead outside of the suits. The Fazbear Fright story, Into the Pit, tells us the dead bodies were lined up against a wall. Yes, I think Into the Pit and the Stitch Wraith timeline, or Stitch line, of Fazbear Frights is canon. And even if it isn't canon, I don't see why it would differ from the games, since it has no reason to. The puppet exists in the Stitch line. Also, we were specifically told by Scott Cawthon that we were supposed to use these books to solve the lore. Plus, even if you don't think Into the Pit, the story is canon, we have Into the Pit, the game, coming out, which is probably in the game's timeline even if the original story wasn't. And it shows the same thing in the trailer, the bodies lined up against the wall. So, since they were killed outside of the suits, according to William in the fourth closet, the animatronics shouldn't have been possessed in the games. This is where I think the puppet comes in. Charlie saw the recently killed children in the suits and tried to save them by helping to bind their souls to the animatronics. How? Something remnant. It just works, okay? ID's Fantasy had a great explanation for one of the Candy Cadet stories that could represent this. In one story, a young woman was sealed in a room with 5 keys, which corresponded to 5 rooms. Each room held a child she could take with her as she fled the building, but she was only allowed to use 1 key. So she melted them down to form 1 key, hoping it would unlock all the doors, but of course it didn't. And so,
rather than leaving her room with a key to 1 life, she had taken with her the key to 5 deaths.
Under this theory, the woman being able to save 1 child represents Charlie being able to save 1 child with her remnant, since we know remnant can heal and possibly even bring back the recently deceased, as shown in the story Frailty. But instead, like the woman in the story, Charlie tries to save all of them by helping them possess the animatronics. Only later did she realize this was a mistake and much worse than letting them move on. The 5 keys forged into 1 represents either Charlie's attempt at saving them or the 5 children's fates being tied together. I think it fits surprisingly well. So then, in the games, William killed the kids first and then stuffed them. After this, the puppet helped bind their souls to the animatronics when they otherwise wouldn't have been. This explanation perfectly explains why William killed them differently in the novels. Since the puppet didn't exist in the novels, it was necessary that the children possess the suits on their own. So, when writing the book, Scott had William kill them inside the suits, so that no further help was needed for the possession to occur. But again, what about Charlie, who didn't die in a suit? She possessed the puppet just fine, so what's up with that? While it's true that Charlie wasn't killed inside or near the puppet does reach Charlie's body and wrap itself around her shortly after William gets to her. As the puppet, we reach Charlie less than a minute after she disappears from the window. It's very possible that she was still dying when the puppet embraced her. You could point to the Give Cake minigame, which shows the child dying before William drives off, but considering we've already had 1 major thing retconned from this minigame, and the fact that the minigame's depictions aren't highly accurate to begin with, I think this can be overlooked. And we already know that Charlie's possession was unique from the others. Give Gifts, Give Life clearly shows that the puppet did something to the kids regarding their possession, but Charlie never needed anything done to her. So using Charlie's possession to disprove this point doesn't work very well when we know that her possession was different from the others. And at any rate, what William said in the fourth closet stands true regardless. For the missing children to possess the animatronics on their own, they needed to be killed inside the suits. Another common objection to the puppet causing the kids' possession is that it runs contrary to Charlie's goals. FNAF 3 clearly shows that Charlie's goal was to free the souls. Wouldn't this go against that? Well, it's definitely true that her motivation has always been to help the children, but that doesn't mean she's always known how best to do that. At the time, Charlie could have been unaware that binding their souls to the suits would be a bad thing. She tried to save them all from death in the only way she knew how, which was to give them life through the animatronics, like her. It was only later that she realized they'd be better off moving on from this life. It's also possible that Charlie had it better than the other kids, in that she describes the others as being like animals, but that she is very aware.
The others are like animals, but I am very aware.
Maybe it wasn't originally so bad for her to possess an animatronic as it ended up being for them, which is why she originally decided to do the same thing to them. Also, depending on whether you believe Charlie was killed at Fredbear's or Freddy's, she had only possessed the puppet for either less than a year or 2 years at the time of the murders. Happiest Day happens at least 30 years later, which is a lot of time for Charlie to realize that maybe being bound to the animatronics forever wasn't as good of a thing as she initially thought. So her intentions were always good, but she still made a mistake. One final thing that people object to about the puppet being responsible is, why does Henry praise her actions toward the children if her actions were what led to them possessing the animatronics? In actuality, Henry isn't very specific about what he's praising her for, just that it's in her nature to protect the innocent, which just describes her kind nature and desire to protect the innocent, and that she lifted/carried others in her arms. None of these statements necessarily refer to give gifts, give life. And Henry is correct in saying this. Charlie says in Ultimate Custom Night,
"The others are under my protection."
Charlie actively protects and cares for them, which is probably what Henry is referring to. Not give gifts, give life, but how she's cared for them since then. She did carry them in her arms, even if she was the one to keep them tied to this life. Also, keep in mind that this is the end of Charlie's life, so Henry is obviously going to want to comfort his daughter and speak positively of her. Obviously, he wouldn't berate her for her mistakes. On top of this, Henry might not have even been aware that it was Charlie who caused their possession. He indicates in the HRY 223 recording that he doesn't know everything.
I don't know how those tiny breaths of life came to inhabit those machines.
So Henry praising her isn't a very good objection either. I think this theory holds up pretty well. Only after killing the kids does William stuff their bodies into the suits, which normally wouldn't be enough to result in possession. But then the puppet stepped in and helped bind their souls to the suits. It allows William to stuff the kids, as the games imply and as he's done in every other continuity, while still giving significance to give gifts, give life, in a way that fits with character motivations and follows the mechanics of the FNAF universe. To me, this is one of the most satisfying theories I've made, in terms of both evidence and narrative. And if we're lucky, Into the Pit will shed some light on some of these older debates on August 8th. It better, because it has the perfect opportunity to do so, going back to the very night of the missing children incident. Also, if the game doesn't clarify the book debate regarding the canonicity of Fazbear Frights and Tales from the Pizzaplex, it's actually over for the theorist community. But if you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate you giving it a like. And if you want to see more theories like this, subscribe and check out some of my other videos. Bye.